Back in the mid-'80s, George Harrison thought he was about to pull off something remarkable. The former Beatle had traded guitars for movie sets, building his own production company, and backing some of Britain's most iconic films. But when he agreed to produce one particular project, everything started to fall apart. The chaos wasn't just on screen. Behind the camera, tempers flared, egos clashed, and Harrison found himself in the middle of a storm led by one of the most famous women in the world. She was bold, unapologetic, and impossible to control, and by the end of it, George Harrison never wanted to see her again. The mystery behind the Quiet Beatle. George Harrison might have been called the Quiet Beatle, but his guitar did more than enough talking for him. He didn't just play music, he redefined what it could sound like. Harrison was the one who brought Indian influences and spirituality into the Beatles' catchy pop world, completely changing the direction of rock music. But George was a walking contradiction. He could be both serene and explosive, a calm seeker of peace with a fiery temper. He lived like a spiritual philosopher, yet still checked off nearly every rock star cliché along the way. Maybe it came from being the youngest Beatle and the baby of his family, but George had a mischievous streak. He even played tricks with something as simple as his own birthday. Officially, he was born just after midnight on February 25, 1943, in Liverpool. But decades later, he decided to stir the pot by jokingly circulating a fake hospital record, claiming he was born on the 24th instead. The prank was so convincing that even the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame updated their records for a while. It was classic Harrison, playful, mysterious, and impossible to fully pin down. Even before he was born, music was already a part of him. His mother, Louise, used to listen to Radio India during her pregnancy, filling their home with the soothing sounds of sitars and tablas. She hoped it would bring her baby some calmness, though his life would turn out to be anything but peaceful. For Harrison, music didn't come from heartbreak. It arrived because of it. One day in 1956, while riding his bike, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel blasting from a nearby house. That moment hit him like lightning. From then on, rock and roll, and especially the guitar, became his obsession. His supportive mother saved up what would be a couple $100 today to buy him his first guitar, unknowingly setting her son on a path that would change music forever. George and his guitar quickly became inseparable. By 1958, at just 14 years old, he was already good enough to audition for the Quarrymen, the early version of the Beatles. His tryout was far from ordinary. It happened on the top of a double-decker bus. Paul McCartney already knew and liked him, but John Lennon wasn't sure. Lennon thought Harrison was too young to hang with the older boys. After all, John was 17 at the time, and a 3-year gap at that age feels like a lifetime. Paul, however, wasn't ready to let George slip away. He arranged another audition, and this time Harrison made sure no one could question his talent. Picture a crowded bus rattling through Liverpool when suddenly a teenage boy pulls out a guitar and starts tearing through a rock and roll solo. That was George Harrison. His performance was so sharp and confident that even Lennon had to admit he'd been wrong about him. Not long after, the group recorded an amateur track featuring an original song with a now rare songwriting credit, McCartney-Harrison. Paul wrote the lyrics while George laid down the solo. Soon enough, that partnership would give way to the world-famous Lennon-McCartney credit. But for a brief moment, the younger guitarist had already left his mark. George Harrison's humbling coming-of-age story. In 1960, the Beatles weren't the Fab Four the world would later worship. They were just a scrappy, hungry band still calling themselves the Quarrymen, grinding it out in Hamburg, Germany's wild club scene. Hamburg was the brainchild of music promoter Alan Williams, who figured British bands would thrive there since the city's rowdy servicemen wanted 3 things: booze, women, and loud rock and roll. Dressed head to toe in leather, the Beatles played marathon sets in dimly lit bars, surrounded by strip joints and chaos. It was rough, reckless, and dangerous. One biographer would later call this period their apprenticeship in the underworld, and that's exactly what it was. Their promoter smuggled them into West Germany without work permits. George Harrison, still only 17, wasn't even old enough to be in the clubs they played. And being the youngest meant endless teasing from the rest of the band, especially about his lack of experience with women. When George finally had his big moment, it wasn't some romantic story. It happened in their grim, prison-like living quarters. Bunk beds, bare bulbs, and concrete walls. Lennon, McCartney, and Pete Best were all right there, cheering him on. It was as far from glamorous as it gets. But his newfound manhood came with consequences. The German authorities weren't impressed, and things were about to spiral fast. Williams had sent the Beatles to Hamburg alongside another band he managed, Derry and the Seniors, hoping the experience would sharpen their sound and expand their reach. It worked. Between 1960 and 1962, Hamburg transformed the Beatles from amateurs into professionals, and even caught the attention of future manager Brian Epstein. Their first gig was at Bruno Koschmider's Indra Club, but they had a problem: no drummer. McCartney and Lennon struggled to find one since drum kits were expensive and good drummers were rare. Then George found Pete Best, who'd been playing with a local band called the Black Jacks, and suddenly the lineup was complete. The clubs they played were deep in Hamburg's red light district, a place crawling with crime after the post-war economic slump. The doormen doubled as bouncers, debt collectors, and occasional thugs. It wasn't the safest playground for four British kids chasing fame. Tensions built up fast. The band hated how they were treated, and being restless teenagers, they started stirring up trouble. At the Kaiserkeller, where they replaced Derry and the Seniors, the stage was barely held together by beer bottles and planks of wood. The Beatles, in a moment of pure mischief, made a bet to see who could break it first. They succeeded, and Koschmider, the furious club owner, sent his men after them. A beating followed, and soon after, they got a better offer from the nearby Top 10 Club. In October 1960, they ditched Koschmider and broke their contract, which was basically declaring war. Koschmider got his revenge by reporting George Harrison for being underage. It was absurd. George had worked for him for months, but suddenly it mattered. The authorities deported him. On November 21, 1960, George was kicked out of Germany. The timing couldn't have been worse. The band had just scored their best gig yet, and now they had to go on without him. George later recalled how devastating it felt to be sent home right as things were looking up. The Top 10 was a better club with better pay, a great sound system, and a real atmosphere. But instead of basking in their success, George was on a train home, broke and exhausted. The others didn't last long either. In one final act of rebellion, they set a rubber on fire in their dingy room, a prank that led to their own deportation. The Beatles' Hamburg adventure ended as chaotically as it began, but looking back, that exit was probably the best thing that could have happened to them. Within a year, they were back in England, with Brian Epstein managing them, a new clean-cut look, and their first single, Love Me Do, making waves. By 1963, Please Please Me had ignited full-blown Beatlemania. Privacy vanished overnight. For the introverted George, that was more exhausting than exciting. The fan mail, the screaming crowds, the non-stop media frenzy, it all became too much. Still, the British press adored them. Reporters wrote about George trying an avocado for the first time, or his preference for an egg sandwich over caviar. They couldn't get enough of the Beatles' charm. Then came America. It was 1964. The country was still reeling from JFK's assassination, and no one knew if the Beatles would connect with U.S. audiences. But Beatlemania was about to go global. Behind the scenes, though, George was in rough shape. The endless touring had wrecked his health. And on the eve of their historic Ed Sullivan Show debut, he came down with a raging 104-degree fever. Doctors ordered him to the hospital, and Epstein panicked. The show was less than a day away, and they couldn't risk word getting out. George's sister Lou fought through skeptical security guards just to see him, armed with medicine and determination. Somehow, she got him ready. When the cameras rolled, 73 million people watched, completely unaware that one of the Beatles was barely standing. By the time the final note rang out, the band had cemented themselves as global icons. Over the next 7 years, George lived in the eye of the storm, famous beyond belief but still feeling left out. Lennon and McCartney dominated the songwriting, often leaving him sidelined. He later admitted there was a sense that they were the Beatles, and he was just watching. But when he did get the spotlight, he delivered timeless hits like Something, Here Comes the Sun, and Taxman. Each one proved he wasn't just the quiet Beatle. He was the soul of the band. And even if it took a while for the world to notice, his music made sure they never forgot. Behind the Beatles' most unexpected romance. George Harrison might have been known as the quiet Beatle, maybe even the most reserved of the group, but when it came to his love life, there was nothing quiet about it. Back in 1964, during the filming of A Hard Day's Night, George met someone who would change his life forever. A young, striking 19-year-old model named Pattie Boyd. She was cast as one of the schoolgirls in a scene, and fate placed her right next to George during lunch. Pattie would later say he was the best-looking man she had ever met. At first, George barely spoke, and Pattie assumed he was painfully shy. But that silence didn't last long. Out of nowhere, he turned to her and asked, "Will you marry me?" When she laughed it off, he shot back with a more grounded follow-up, "Will you have dinner with me tonight?" Pattie had to say no. She already had a boyfriend. Her friends wasted no time calling her crazy, and soon enough, she realized they were right. She ended the relationship and, just 10 days later, ran into George again during a photo shoot. This time, she made sure he knew she was single. From that moment on, their story became rock and roll history. 2 years later, on January 21st, 1966, George Harrison and Pattie Boyd tied the knot. It wasn't your typical celebrity wedding, though. Despite the Beatles being at the height of their fame, the ceremony was small and intimate. According to Pattie's memoir, Wonderful Tonight, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and me. Only one other Beatle attended, Paul McCartney, who also served as George's best man. During the ceremony, Paul sat between George's parents, but even he couldn't resist bringing some lightheartedness to the day. When Pattie's younger half-brothers, David and Boo, started to get restless, Paul decided to entertain them. He led them outside, where they stumbled upon an unused bathroom filled with stacks of fan mail addressed to Mrs. Harrison. Amid all the letters, they discovered George's bow and arrows. In a burst of playful energy, Paul showed the boys how to use them. The fun ended abruptly when David fired an arrow straight into the bonnet of Paul's gleaming Rolls-Royce. While love sparked George's personal life, his artistic awakening came from something entirely different: psychedelics. By 1965, George and John Lennon were exploring LSD, a journey that would pull George toward Eastern spirituality. For him, it felt like coming full circle, back to the Indian music he'd first heard on Radio India as a child. This new fascination transformed his songwriting and guitar playing. Suddenly, the sitar found its way into the Beatles' music, adding a sound the world had never heard before. When Revolver dropped in 1966, it was clear that George Harrison was no longer just the quiet Beatle. He had found his voice. Alongside Pattie, he embraced yoga, vegetarianism, and meditation. Their friendship with sitar master Ravi Shankar, who interestingly was Norah Jones's father, became central to their lives. Together, George and Pattie were living a spiritual and cultural lifestyle that was decades ahead of its time. But enlightenment didn't shield them from trouble. In March 1969, their peaceful world came crashing down. On March 12th, George was at the Beatles' headquarters when he got a frantic call from Patty. Police were raiding their home on suspicion of possession. By the time George arrived, officers had found enough hashish to arrest them both. Despite the chaos, the couple didn't hide away. That same evening, they attended a high society party that included Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon. George, terrified about the legal fallout, thought Lord Snowdon might be able to help. But before he could make his move, Patty spotted her sister offering a joint to the princess. She rushed over and stopped her just in time. Getting arrested twice in one day wasn't something either of them wanted. It was a moment that summed up the contradictions of George Harrison's life. He could preach about spiritual purity one day and dive headfirst into the rock and roll excesses the next. His assistant, Chris O'Dell, once described it perfectly. One minute George was devoted to Hindu discipline, and the next he was ready to drink, do coke, and party. Even his patience with spirituality had its breaking points, like the time he told a flight attendant off for interrupting his meditation. As tensions inside the Beatles grew, and his personal life became more chaotic, George Harrison's quest for peace was constantly tested. What lay ahead for him wasn't just a test of faith, it was a reckoning with the very contradictions that defined who he was. George Harrison's breaking point nobody saw coming. The Beatles' breakup wasn't one explosive moment. It was a slow-motion collapse that had been brewing for years. By the late 60s, George Harrison had started spending time with Bob Dylan and the band in Woodstock. That trip changed everything for him. After years of feeling boxed in by the Lennon-McCartney dominance, he suddenly found himself surrounded by musicians who treated each other like equals, a brotherhood that shared ideas and respect. It was the complete opposite of the creative hierarchy he'd been stuck in, and it only made the quiet resentment he'd been carrying grow stronger. When the band started recording the White Album, things turned ugly. The tension was unbearable. Arguments broke out constantly, egos clashed, and creative control became a full-on war zone. Ringo even quit for a couple of weeks just to escape the madness. Yet, in the middle of all that chaos, George was more inspired than ever, writing some of his strongest material to date. Anyone who's seen Peter Jackson's documentary, Get Back, can feel George's frustration. The scene where Paul McCartney accuses him of vamping is especially painful to watch. George later said it never came to blows. The tension was real. Being filmed while all this was happening only made it worse. When he finally walked out, Lennon coldly joked that they could replace him with Eric Clapton. But something had changed in George. His time with the band had given him confidence and a fresh perspective. After 5 tense days, he came back to finish what they'd started. Not long after, the Beatles played their legendary rooftop concert on January 30th, 1969. Within months, Let It Be was released, and then it was all over. The Beatles were done. George was still in his 20s and suddenly free to create on his own terms. He had a vault of unreleased songs and an urge to finally step out of the long shadows of Lennon and McCartney. On the personal side, he went big, buying Friar Park, an enormous Victorian Gothic mansion just outside London, with 25 bedrooms, a ballroom, and sprawling gardens. It looked like the perfect place to start a new life with his wife, Pattie Boyd. But inside those grand walls, life was anything but peaceful. Friar Park quickly turned into a whirlwind of excess. Alcohol and cocaine flowed freely, parties blurred into days, and there was little sense of order or control. Pattie would later describe it as a madhouse, a time when life felt completely unhinged. And while the chaos raged, George blurred the line between the spiritual and the reckless. He even invited families from the Hare Krishna movement to live on the estate, turning Friar Park into part temple, part circus. Pattie, overwhelmed by their free-spirited parenting, once had to rescue a toddler from drowning in the garden pond, twice. Beneath all the madness, there was real heartbreak. George and Pattie had been trying to start a family, but it wasn't happening. Patty would later say that discovering she couldn't have children was one of the hardest moments of her life. George refused to consider adoption, and that emotional distance only deepened the cracks already spreading through their marriage. Still, in the middle of all that personal turmoil, George created something extraordinary. His masterpiece, All Things Must Pass. Released just months after the Beatles' breakup, it was a triple album overflowing with songs that had been sidelined during his time with the band. Tracks like Isn't It a Pity and Let It Down, both rejected by Lennon and McCartney, finally got their moment to shine. Critics went wild. Melody Maker called him free, and the Washington Post praised him as the genius behind the Beatles. For the first time, George Harrison wasn't the quiet one in the background. He was leading the show. The album's biggest hit, My Sweet Lord, became a global anthem, blending rock and gospel in a way no one had done before. George had actually written it for his friend Billy Preston, but ended up recording it himself. Unfortunately, the joy of success didn't last long. Bright Tunes Music sued him for allegedly copying He's So Fine by the Chiffons. Years later, a judge ruled that George had subconsciously plagiarized the song. It was a humiliating setback, but even that couldn't overshadow the album's brilliance. Yet, for all the musical triumph, George's personal life was unraveling fast. The dream of a peaceful, spiritual home life had been replaced with isolation, addiction, and betrayal. Patty, already heartbroken over their struggles to have children, found herself facing another blow: infidelity. George had started using cocaine heavily, and according to Patty, it changed him completely. She said it froze his emotions and hardened his heart. And then came the affair, the one that would finally end their marriage. It started with little signs, photos, late-night visits from a woman who claimed she was just there to listen to George play. But Patty knew better. The real shock came when she discovered who the woman was: Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife. The day Patty confronted them, the situation turned surreal. She stormed upstairs to find the bedroom door locked, banging and shouting until she heard laughter on the other side. When George finally opened the door, his excuse was almost cruel in its casualness. He said Maureen was just tired and lying down. That was the breaking point. Patty went straight to Ringo and told him everything. His reaction was pure fury. But George wasn't finished twisting the knife. The very next night, during a dinner party, he publicly declared that he was in love with Maureen. The entire room fell silent in shock. Even John Lennon later said the whole situation felt like a betrayal between family members. By New Year's Eve 1974, George ended what was left of the marriage, asking Patty for a divorce. And what followed would make anyone wonder whether karma had finally come calling. George Harrison's final days revealed. November 9th, 2001. It was a hard day for music fans everywhere. ABC News reported that George Harrison was heading in for another round of radiation treatment, this time at Staten Island University Hospital in New York. He was battling a brain tumor, the result of cancer that had already spread from his lungs. The treatment he was scheduled to receive was known as fractionated radiation therapy. It had been around for decades and was designed to precisely target the tumor while sparing as much healthy brain tissue as possible. It sounded promising in theory, but the reality was far more serious. Reports suggested the procedure might be coming too late. The cancer had already advanced too far. Dr. Gil Lederman, George's physician, spoke optimistically, saying the treatment had a success rate in the high 90s. But another expert, Dr. Stephen Tatter from the Wake Forest University Gamma Knife Center, quickly clarified that those numbers could be misleading. He explained that the success rate often reflected short-term results. If a patient passed away before the tumor returned, it still counted as a success on paper. As he put it, the real-world figures told a different story. Survival rates dropped to around 60% after a year. Dr. Robert Fenstermaker of the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo also weighed in, explaining that it's usually the primary cancer, in George's case, the lung cancer, that ends up taking the patient's life. not the secondary brain tumor. Just days later, on November 12, 2001, something deeply moving took place. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr came to visit George in his Manhattan hotel room. The three remaining Beatles shared a final private reunion, a chance to reminisce about the days that had changed music forever. Dr. Lederman, who was there, later recalled the emotional yet joyful tone of that meeting. There were tears, yes, but far more laughter. They joked, reminisced, and spent hours together, slipping back into the easy rhythm of old friends. He described George as calm and full of dignity, saying that after Paul and Ringo left, he seemed peaceful and happy. A close friend of the group confirmed the same, noting that George likely knew this was the last time they'd see each other. Just a few weeks later, on November 29, 2001, the world lost George Harrison. He passed away at the age of 58 in Los Angeles, surrounded by loved ones. His wife, Olivia, his son, Donnie, and his siblings mourned privately, while fans around the world gathered at Beatles landmarks to pay their respects. The outpouring of love was immense. Fellow musicians and friends like Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and Mick Jagger shared their tributes, each remembering the quiet Beatle who had given the world so much beauty through his music. Though George wasn't always in the spotlight like John or Paul, his songwriting had left an indelible mark. Songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps stood among the most cherished in the Beatles' entire catalog, proof of his deep emotional reach and understated brilliance. George Harrison truly hated her. Back in 1978, former Beatle George Harrison decided to take a surprising new path. He launched his own movie production company, Handmade Films. What started as a passion project quickly turned into something special. The company became a major player in British cinema, backing and producing cult classics like Time Bandits, Monty Python's Life of Brian, Mona Lisa, and Withnail and I. But not every project turned into gold. In fact, one film nearly sank the company's reputation. Shanghai Surprise. Released in 1986, it starred Madonna and her then-husband Sean Penn, two of the biggest celebrities of the decade. For Madonna, it was supposed to be her big step into serious acting after her breakout in Desperately Seeking Susan. Instead, the movie turned out to be a nightmare. Critics tore it apart, audiences stayed away, and Madonna ended up winning a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Actress. From the very beginning, the production seemed cursed. Cast members later recalled that working on the film was a miserable experience. One co-star described Madonna as a pain in the ass, while the set itself was constantly under siege from paparazzi desperate to photograph the world's most talked-about couple. To make things worse, the crew had to deal with constant disruptions, filming under a flight path, poor planning, and constant tension behind the camera. Director Jim Goddard, by most accounts, struggled to keep control of the situation. Actor Clyde Kusatsu later said that Goddard, a gentle and soft-spoken man, simply wasn't prepared for the level of fame and chaos that came with directing Madonna and Penn. The pressure of handling such high-profile stars was overwhelming, and the whole production started to spiral. Actor Richard Ng, who also appeared in the film, later revealed that George Harrison's involvement actually helped calm things down. Harrison, who also composed the film's music, acted as a sort of peacekeeper on set. He tried to mediate between the warring personalities and bring some order to the chaos. But even a Beatle couldn't save the film. Despite the star power and high expectations, Shanghai Surprise was a complete box office disaster, earning only $2 million and losing about $15 million in the process. Madonna later reflected on the turmoil, admitting that the set was filled with tension between the director and the cast. She also took a few shots at Harrison, saying she felt he wasn't helping the situation and often made things worse with his comments. Harrison, for his part, maintained that he managed to have a few laughs during production, but that didn't change the outcome. When all was said and done, Shanghai's Surprise became one of the most infamous flops of the 1980s, and a rare misstep in George Harrison's otherwise impressive post-Beatles legacy.